Well, Sabbath greetings to everyone. Hope you've had a fantastic week. It is getting really interesting around the West Home. It's a little bit before 5 o'clock as I'm recording this, and I'm bound and determined to get through another proverb tonight in the Sabbath greetings video. But we are supposed to be out of the house here in about 15 minutes or so for another home showing. So we never know exactly when they're going to come by, but this one they were able to get it done before the Sabbath. So we're trying to be as accommodating as we can because the owners of this home have been so good to us. So we're trying to accommodate them even when it's not very convenient most of the time. But anyway, it's been a good, productive week here for the most part, and I wanted to get through Proverbs 5. Proverbs 5. We haven't done that yet in our little going through Proverbs. We haven't done that during the Sabbath greetings. Last time we did Proverbs 7. It was one we hadn't covered yet, and a big part of Proverbs 7 was the harlot, the crafty harlot, talking about harlotry, adultery, fornication, that sort of thing. Proverbs 5 is along the same lines. And what I want to point out as we're talking about adultery is a lot of times the physical act of committing adultery, of being unfaithful. That is often parallel or a type of spiritual adultery. And so anytime we read that in the scripture, we can understand there is a type, and there's actually another type or an antitype, which is the physical versus the spiritual. And the fact of the matter is that that's always true here as we talk about it, because that's what's being reflected in whether or not we're faithful to our mate and faithful and avoiding fornication and adultery. It is a parallel. It's a type. It's a metaphor for a spiritual relationship that we have with God, and not committing spiritual fornication or spiritual adultery. So we look at that, and this is so much a theme going through all the Proverbs. Proverbs 5 says that, "My son, pay attention to my wisdom and lend your ear to my understanding." Bow your ear. Listen. Be attentive. Listen to what I'm saying, that you may preserve discretion. Preserve discretion. Keep it. Preserve it for the long term. Make sure that you're thinking about it. And the center reference in my Bible says, appreciate good judgment. Yes, appreciate good judgment. And your lips may keep knowledge. So appreciate good judgment, preserve discretion, and your lips may keep knowledge. For the lips of an immoral woman drip honey, and her mouth is smoother than oil. There's always something enticing us. If we think about it physically, it's almost like all the marketing people out there have read the Proverbs, and they know, how can we entice people to buy a certain product? How can we entice people to start thinking, get their minds focused on something that we're trying to sell them? Right here. Because the lips of an immoral woman drip honey, and her mouth is smoother than oil. It's something that we're attracted to. It's something, especially in this regard, men are attracted to in this way. And so marketers use that appeal, that same premise, to try and get us to buy things that they're, for these companies that they're representing. Verse 4, "But in the end she is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword." It never works out to be unfaithful and to be an adulterous individual. "Her feet go down to death, her steps lay hold of hell, lest you ponder her path of life. Her ways are unstable, you do not know them." So, it looks enticing, it looks good, but you got to stay away from it, because it's leading to a path of death and hell. And that was the other theme we saw running through Proverbs 7. "Therefore hear me now, my children, and do not depart from the words of my mouth. Remove your way far from her, and do not go near the door of her house, lest you give your honor to others and your years to the cruel one." Now that's an interesting thing to talk about when we're talking about the throes of adultery, and we're talking about the throes of spiritual adultery. What are we doing? Casting all of this attention and care and love and honor onto the evil one as we attach ourselves to these pagan holidays, and they become so much a part of what we do and what we think and how we act from year to year. And yet this is what it's talking about here. You're giving your years to the cruel one, giving yourself over to these pagan ideas and these pagan practices. It's not what God honors. It's not what He This is the spiritual analogy here. The spiritual implication of this applies as well as to someone who would commit physical adultery. Verse 10, lest aliens be filled with your wealth and your labors go to the house of a foreigner. And what do we see happening now in our immoral society, our adulterous generation, an adulterous society? And we see those very same things beginning to happen now because the people have cast off all restraint when it comes to homosexuality and adultery and all these other things that are tolerated in our society. In verse 11 it says, and you mourn at last when your flesh and your body are consumed. And this is what happens. I mentioned last week, about the headlines and how much these STDs are on the rise. They don't want to talk about the cause of these things. They don't want to talk about that. They don't want to talk about curing it. They want to talk about finding a drug to treat it. But they don't want to talk about what it takes to keep from getting it in the first place, and that is to stop being an adulterous society and a society that's filled with fornicators. When your flesh and your body are consumed, you talk to those people that are dealing with some of these STDs, and they'll tell you it really in the end it's not worth it. Her ways are the ways of death, this adultery and fornication. And say, how I have hated instruction and my heart despised correction. When anybody comes along in this society and tries to put a light on all the nonsense that goes on, the adultery and the fornication, they're ridiculed and they're spoken of as being ridiculous. And yet it says here, they hate instruction. They don't want correction. It says it right there, my heart despised correction. I have not obeyed the voice of my teachers, nor inclined my ear to those who instructed me. What is the church of God there to do? To provide instruction, to provide guidance in all these things, and to use this book and all the principles we've been covering here in the book of Proverbs. If they would just apply them, then things would turn around very, very quickly. Verse 14, I was on the verge of total ruin in the midst of the assembly and congregation. Drink water from your own cistern. See, that's just kind of a poetic way of saying, if you're married, by all means, have a wonderful relationship with your spouse. But drink water from your own cistern. Don't try to step outside of your marriage and do it that way, either in your mind or physically. Either one, as we know, the New Testament teaches us. It's not just the letter, but the spirit of the law of adultery. And running water from your own well. Should your fountains be dispersed abroad? Streams of water in the streets? See, that's not the way to do things. Let them be only your own and not for strangers with you. Let your fountain be blessed and rejoice with the wife of your youth. Yes, rejoice with the wife of your youth. That should be a vital, active part of your marriage. Absolutely. As a loving deer and a graceful doe, let her breast satisfy you at all times and always be enraptured with her love. Beautiful poetic talk about marriage and the use of sex, the right use of sex in marriage. But be pleased with that. Be satisfied with that. You don't have to look elsewhere when you're in a relationship, in a marriage, where each one is taking care of the other's needs. Yes, physically and emotionally. In verse 20, for why should you, my son, be enraptured by an immoral woman and be embraced in the arms of a seductress? For the ways of man are before the eyes of the Lord, and he ponders all his paths. His own iniquities entrap the wicked man, and he is caught in the cords of his sin. See, that's what happens. Eventually, all things will catch up with us. He shall die for lack of instruction, and in the greatness of his folly he shall go astray. They die for lack of instruction. It says in another place right here that it's not so much even, they just don't listen to the ones that are trying to instruct them. They either haven't gotten any instruction to begin with, and a lot of times we can call out the parents too many times in this world who are not teaching and instructing their children about the proper use of sex, not teaching them how to date properly, not teaching them those types of things. And so they haven't been instructed, and so what happens? They get caught up in the cords of their sin. As soon as those things become active in our bodies and we go through those changes in life, those things become something we have to be instructed on so that we can use it properly and at the right time and in the right way in marriage. So again, there's the physical, there's the spiritual. And we see why this world is being destroyed. It's because they're going after, they're in spiritual adultery. And they're not obeying the great God. Instead, they're being torn apart by pagan practices and living those pagan ways, and living those ways are ways that lead eventually to death. And they don't know it, but they are following the evil one. Well, that's Proverbs chapter 5, and we've done pretty good in time this time, so I will leave it there. We are looking very much forward to seeing the brethren in Joliet this Sabbath. We look forward to seeing them, and the rest of you, we love you, and we'll look forward to seeing more of you coming up very, very soon in Janesville for the for the last day of Unleavened Bread, and then streaming on the first day of Unleavened Bread, where we'll be, God willing, we'll be streaming from Chicago. So I love you all. I hope you have a fantastic Sabbath wherever you plan to keep it. If you're sick, I'm praying for you. Love each other, help and serve each other, and we'll talk to you all again real soon. Have a wonderful, profitable Sabbath day.